buttonhole placement. Now I'm going to show you how I choose to place my buttons and buttonholes. That's my button I'm going to have at the top. Place it sort of fairly centrally on the waistband so that it looks nice. You can see this one's got a shank, and I'm going to put a pin right at the edge of the shank because that's where my buttonhole needs to start. That's where I want it to sit. Now measure halfway between each edge of my waistband and put another pin in, so that where those two pins cross, albeit wonkily, is where the start of my buttonhole needs to be. Now my next one I've placed 3 centimetres below the waistband, and I'm just placing my button on to check that that looks all right. That's a nice gap. Now I'm doing 8 centimetres between each pin because I think that's a nice spacing for this size of button. So that's how far apart they need to be. Now I'm placing my button on the button stand fairly centrally again, and I'm going to push a pin through the buttonhole. That way I know that's where that buttonhole is going to be stitched on. That's where the threads are going to be. So again, that's where my buttonhole needs to start. Marking with the chalk where the pins are. Take the pins out because obviously you can't sew a buttonhole over pins. So basically you need to repeat that for each button position, assuming your buttons are all the same size. So you always need to practice your buttonhole on a scrap, an interfaced scrap of fabric. You can see I've marked my buttonhole as it will be marked on the actual garment. Now this is how I sew buttonholes on my domestic, or one of my domestic machines. This little gadget fits the button in, and you slide it so that it kind of measures how big the button is, so that your buttonhole will come out, in theory, the correct size. I'm attaching the foot to my machine now. That's a guide that needs to be pulled down for this process to work on this machine. So I've got my cross there, and I need to put that cross where the needle is going to come down. So that's going to be, this machine works backwards first, so that's going to be the start of my buttonhole. I've got my button in, off I go. All I have to do here is put my foot down. The machine does everything for me. Incidentally, always good to practice buttonholes because my machine needs a smaller button in the button foot to make the correct size buttonhole for my buttons. Nobody wants a baggy buttonhole. So here we go, look, beautiful buttonhole, front and back, very easy one-step process. So now for my very basic Genome 7021, you have to mark both ends of the buttonhole for this one because it's much more manual process. I'm going to put the foot down over that first chalk mark and go forward. This machine goes forward first for its first step, and it's up to me to stop it accurately on that chalk mark. Then I do the second process, which is the big sort of bar tack. Now poor old girl doesn't like going backwards so she reluctantly does. Your machine, if it does this buttonhole, should do it properly as it goes backwards. So I have to go forwards again. I do the bar tack at the back, and then I have to do the step 1 again, which is the forward zigzag, to get a complete buttonhole. But she does it, so I can't complain really. There we go. Let's have a look at that one. There we go, not quite as beautiful, but it's done, and it's adequate. Always check that your buttonholes come out the right size, even if it's a flashy automatic one like mine was. You can see the bar tacks fall nicely either side of the button. That is perfect. Do more than one practice as well. I'm going to check my button against all my practices there. Brilliant, that looks great. Now to cut these guys open. This is my genome buttonhole. I'm going to just use my scissors to cut this one. This is one method. Fold it in half like this and then just snip between the zigzag stitches. It's a bit tough. Try and get your scissors in and just snip up to the bar tacks. That's one way. Another way is a buttonhole chisel. This is fairly new to me. I've never owned one before and it was a bit exciting getting to use it for the first time. Just put the mat underneath, and the blade is very, very sharp, so you have to be careful. But basically I'm just wiggling it backwards and forwards along the buttonhole gap. As you can see, it's still got a couple of threads that need a snip, but it's done a reasonable job of cutting that open. Now this method was the way that I would have done it before my chisel. I put a pin on the inside of the bar tacks on either end. These act as a barrier so I can't cut past the bar tacks that are securing the end of my buttonholes. Trusty unpicker. Pop it into the fabric and just slide it up towards the pin, and the pin just, as I said, stops you slicing all the way through the fabric. Nice clean buttonhole. Next we need to place the buttons. So again, this is my method. I'm sure there's others out there. I like to place my button stands on top of each other and pin them together so I know they're exactly where I want them to lie when the buttons are done up. And then I place a pin right at the top there of the buttonhole, just before that bar tack again, so I know that's where I want the thread holding my button onto my skirt to go, for my skirt to be closed properly and for it to sit nicely. So then I just unpin that centre front, and where that pin's going into the fabric there underneath, I just slide another one in to mark it so I know that's exactly right. Obviously do that for all the buttons. So now I've marked all my buttonholes with the pin, I'm going to pop a little bit of chalk on there so I've got a nice little dot. I know exactly where my button threads need to go. So I've got my button there and I'm looking through the holes for the chalk. And I'm going to put that first buttonhole, the one on the right, on that chalk. Now I've put my button under my foot and I'm just doing a zigzag. You have to do this, wheel it by hand to start with to make sure you get the right width on your zigzag machine, but you can sew them on the machine if you choose. Personally, I quite like a cup of tea and a bit of hand sew, but this is a perfectly valid way to do it. So there you go, all done. Enjoy.